Mhm. Good morning. Welcome to Lena Valley. I'm Pastor Dan Hutchison, and this is not our usual uh, morning service, but we have been doing a series on money matters, and we thought it was important to finish it up. We have moved on currently into talking about a series on the meaning of life, but before, but we actually spent 7 weeks on what are the things about money. What's it applicable to our lives, and why do we sometimes avoid it? And of course, this series too, this morning, being on practicing tithing, which is quite an important part of our Christian living, and something that it's great to know in depth. Where does tithing come from? And so this morning, we're going to take some time to unpack that, what it says in the Old Testament about tithing, and what does that mean for us today as Christians living in the 21st century. What does that mean for us? And I'm going to finish actually with a few stories about how I have experiences of tithing in my life and how God has blessed me through that. But I found growing up, a lot of pastors used a joke to start with, and I feel we've lost that a little bit. So I wanted to start with a joke this morning, and thanks to Scott Huss as well for his sick joke of the day, because that's where this has come from. It goes like this. On a Sunday morning, a pastor told his congregation that the church needed some extra money. He asked the people to consider donating a little more money than usual into the offering plate. He said, whoever gave the most money could pick 3 hymns. After the offering plate was passed around, the pastor glanced down and noticed that someone had placed a $1,000 bill in the offering. I don't know what a $1,000 bill looks like, but I'll tell you what, I'd be pretty happy if I see one of those in the offering. He was so excited, he immediately shared his joy with his congregation. He said he'd like to personally thank the person who placed the money in the plate. A very quiet, elderly, saintly-looking lady, all the way at the back, shyly raised her hand. The pastor asked her to come to the front. Slowly, she made her way to the pastor down the aisle. He told her how wonderful it was that she gave so much, and in thanks she could pick 3 hymns. Her eyes brightened as she looked over the congregation and pointed to 3 most handsome men in the building. I'll take him, him, and him. Now, it's a funny story of how sometimes, though, we can look at tithing. As I mentioned, it can be a bit of a taboo topic, and I think we are currently, we just finished this series on money matters, but we're also later looking at sexuality, and I think I've just added the third controversial topic of worship in church. But keeping to this series, I think that's something that we can move far away from when we have a lack of talking about why tithing is important and what it's about. Then we can lose sight of what it really means. We can think that it is just to buy a hymn in the service, or a right to have a say in the church because of our money, or that we have a right to pull it back when we're not happy. Maybe it's that we think that we can pay God and say, oh, well, here's my entry ticket to heaven. I've given my tithe, I've given what is required. But when we actually have a look through the Old Testament, and it's quite fascinating learning about what tithing meant to the Israelites when the law was first set up, and also how the Hebrews would have seen tithing in their day. So let's just take a little walk through the Old Testament. There's 4 times, significant times that tithing is mentioned. There's more references to that, but 4 significant ones we're going to look at this morning. And the first time it's recorded is actually in Genesis, when Abraham was saving his nephew Lot, and he carried away this big plunder. He saved him, and they plundered these guys, and as they came back from that trip, they came across this king Melchizedek of Shalem, and he was the priest of the God Most High. He blessed Abraham, and Abraham decided to give him a tenth of the plunder. This was his intent. This intention was significant because it soon became the template that we hear then in the law. Now, what's interesting here is this is 400 years before Moses. This is this has come to a man that is cited regularly as a man of faith. And we're going to talk a bit about, I'll reference that also in Hebrews 7 later. But Moses being a man of the law. So it's interesting here that it is actually Abraham, the man of faith, that is first talked about as to do with tithing. Then we do move into the books of the law, into the Torah, which, all of this is the Torah, the first 5 books, but particularly the book of Leviticus 27. And what's interesting here, again, it's not under the label finances of how to manage your money. It's actually under the heading laws about vows. Now, a vow is something that you decide to enter into. It becomes, in a case, a covenant between you and another person. And it's clear here in the Old Testament that this is how the tithing is to be taken. It's to be taken as a covenant. A vow between you and God. And at the end of chapter 27, it sets a mandate that of 10th of all your produce of one's land or flock, that should be given to the Lord. We are then given a little bit more context in Numbers 18, 8 to 32, where it explains that the tithe and the offerings are to be given to the Levites. Now, Levites are the 12th tribe of Israel, and they were to tend to the tabernacle. So otherwise they had no other source of income, and who in turn would give a tithe to the priest. So there's already that expectation that even religious workers were subject to the law of tithing. Again, in Deuteronomy, we get even more context, and this one actually was really interesting to me. In chapter 14, 22 to 29, we also hear that every third year the tithe should actually go towards a local storehouse so that it can be distributed to the Levites, but also to the poor and marginalised. In the Book of Tobit, which is considered canon in Catholic and Orthodox denominations, but not as much in the Jewish canon, but however it does shed some light on what was expected. A good man, meaning a person who chose to give a tithe, would give an annual tithe to a son of Levi who acted as the temple staff. Another tenth then went to religious festivals each year in Jerusalem, which actually was consumed by them, by the offering giver. And a third tithe was then supported to support the poor and the needy, anyone who was unable to care for themselves. It's generally believed that the rabbinic system, the first tithe was collected annually, and that went to the Levites. The second was due every first and second, fourth and fifth year, and that third one, for the poor and the needy, was every third and sixth year. It's interesting to note, we've talked about the context now of all these, what was considered in the tithe, but also on top of that, Moses commanded the Israelites to give a temple tax. And now this was just a standard fee and expected for all to pay. And the purpose of it was actually to provide skilled workers and money for upkeep and renovation of the tabernacle, which then in Chronicles and Kings we see that used for the temple. Just want to park that thought with you for a moment. So hearing all this, did the Israelites always follow it? Well, no. Hezekiah, he found it necessary in 2 Chronicles 31 to bring Israel back to that. He was a teacher, and actually, if you was here on the Sunday morning that Heather Menzies and the Energy Kids leaders and kids did a great play on always listen to your teacher. He was a great man that taught Israel the importance of tithing and the importance of blessing the community through that. We then get this great image, powerful and sad image in Ezekiel, where God's glory is leaving the temple. They're continually keeping up their practices, their festivals, but God says, look, the poor are being neglected, the needy are not being considered, and God's glory leaves the temple because, justice is not happening from the temple. When they come back from exile in Nehemiah 13, we read the story of the tithe, again, not being honoured, and so the Levites have gone back to the fields to earn their own income. Nehemiah, he re-establishes the storehouses so that the Levites could go back to service and living a life serving. But probably the most interesting and challenging passage in the Old Testament, it actually comes towards the end, and kind of a lasting thought for Israel as they come back from exile, is in Malachi 3, 8 to 10. Let me read it to you. It says, "Will a mere mortal rob God? Yet you rob me. But you ask, why are you robbing me? In tithes and offerings, you are under a curse, your whole nation, because you have robbed me. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be enough room to store it." This is a pretty powerful passage, and sometimes I think we can misread it. To be honest, I've misread it in the past. God says here, "Test me on this, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be enough room to store it." Now, it's easy to think about us personally that my storehouse will be overflowing, but as we've just discovered, the Old Testament is actually talking about a storehouse that is to be used for the community. It's to go towards the festivals. It's to go towards the poor and the needy. The temple staff as well. The community actually is blessed from the tithe. It's blessed from us challenging God in this to see a community blessed through respecting the tithe. So without the tithe, I think two things happen. Firstly, we see the glory of God removed. His abundance goes missing. And the second thing is the nation, the community, suffers. What does this have to do with us today? Well, when we enter the Gospels, it's helpful to have that framework in mind, so that what the Israelites knew to be what tithing was about. And it actually gives us a bit of an insight of what God sets up as a regular pattern, a pattern of blessing the community through our tithing. Matt, a couple of weeks ago, unpacked more about stewardship, but I just want to quickly recap on that and the importance of seeing all our resources as God's resources, as from God. And that being that giving Him 10% doesn't discharge our stewardship, meaning that with the remaining 90% we can do whatever we please. I mean, for the Israelites, especially early on, agriculturally, they interpreted the first fruits or the firstborn offerings to be symbolic of the belief that the entire crop or herd was God's gift to man. Each tithe was in recognition that man owed all he had to God and giving from his bounty. R. Turnbull actually made this interesting point of even the calling of the elected Hebrew people being symbolic that all men belong to God. They were not set apart on their own privilege, but actually set apart to be a light to all nations. Again, to bless the community. God's pattern is taking a remnant, a percentage of the whole, to bless others. Thus, for a covenant people, the tithe must be seen as a link between the Creator and the elements of His creation, between a system of belief, the law, and a means of expression, a heart. It's to be an expression of faith. Batred, who wrote God's Stewards, added to this concept by saying, "It is not right to ask whether the steward idea, being tithing, should be based on the law or the gospel. It must rather be based on a dialect between the two. But in this tension between the law and the gospel, the law is constantly overcome by the gospel." Talking about the gospel, where does it mention about tithing? Where does Jesus mention about tithing? There's actually only 4 points in the Old Testament that use the word tithing. And one I alluded to earlier about Hebrews chapter 7, which is really a chapter about talking about Jesus being a priest outside of the Levites, outside of the law, that Jesus is in the order of Melchizedek. And when you read that passage too, it does talk about tithing as well. Tithing being Abraham, making a choice to tithe, and therefore is not necessarily tied down to being in the law. But probably what is even more interesting is the 3 times that Jesus mentions tithing. Once is just in a story, in a parable that doesn't have particular meaning, but twice, there's 2 times, one in Matthew and one in Luke, where Jesus gives great reference to tithing. As we know, Jesus quite regularly challenged the Pharisees, talking to them about how they were so focused on being clean on the outside but not on the in. Talking to them about how they depended too much on the law and how they'd built it up to make it too heavy for anyone else to carry. But this is actually an interesting time. This is one time that Jesus actually seems to endorse their practice. They are just going about it the wrong way. In Matthew 23:23, he says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, your mint, your dill, your cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness." You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You should have practiced the tithing without neglecting justice, without neglecting mercy and faithfulness. Luke actually is talking about the same interaction, and he uses the words again, justice, but he also uses the love of God. You shouldn't be practicing tithing without the love of God. Therefore, tithing then is an obedient thing to do. But we shouldn't see it as some heroic or sacrificial thing, something to be impressed about. Tithing is an obedience 101. It's for beginners. It's an entry-level discipleship. When we tithe, we should be thinking, well, this is for starters, and I grow from here. So let's tithe. Let's be boldly using our tithe and thinking about the demanding questions of how we're using it for justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Trusting and obeying Jesus no matter the cost. And I know for myself personally, as I just want to share some stories from my life to do with tithing, it's certainly been helpful in my walk. And to start with, going back 10 years ago of when I first coming on to Citywide, I grew up on the northwest coast and had a gap year, so I'd started earning some money and knew the value or the importance of tithing, but didn't know actually all this concept behind it, this theological kind of background. But just knew personally that it was something that I needed to do, and in a sense I'd struggled at my old church because on the way I'd always get to Sunday morning and look at the wallet and go, there's only a bit of cash in there, so I would either stop at the bank on the way or just give what I had, which I didn't really think was a very holy thing to do. So I was certainly grateful when I came to Citywide and seeing that there was direct debit and therefore a little bit, I think like the story of Cain and Abel, where Abel gave his first fruits and God was pleased with that. And I knew it was important to kind of budget and think about what were my first fruits that I could be offering. And so I kind of thought, oh yes, I'm doing the Abel thing. I'm putting my first fruits, but in a sense, I also knew that I had kind of backed off. I'd coming from on the northwest, being involved in youth ministry and leading camps and quite involved. I had stepped back to say, oh well, now I've come to Hobart to focus on uni, so that's my focus. I will give my tithe, and God can have that, but I'll be focusing on studying and uni, so that's my priority. But it was interesting that even with that tithe, it gave God an entryway of saying, how am I using my time? And over as I came along to Citywide, I became more and more excited about the opportunities we had here and wanted to be more and more involved. I remember one night I had an assignment due, or maybe it was an exam coming up, and I was kind of working through, should I stay home and study or should I go and fellowship with fellow believers? And I knew for me it was an important choice to make that, to go and to fellowship, because I guess as you study, you kind of, I was studying zoology and botany and the what talks about there in Matthew about do not worry, because he cares for the birds and flowers the fields, and I knew that very much how magnificent God was able to do that. So how much I didn't need to worry about finances, didn't need to worry about my study as much, because I knew that if my priority was first Jesus, then the rest would fall in place. And that certainly has been my experience. I've been very blessed, even though while I was at uni, I was on youth allowance, and that was part of the decision of giving a tenth of that. I never had to worry about money. I never had to be concerned or live paycheck to paycheck, and even had money for extra things like games and CDs, or CDs at that time. Now we just have Spotify, but still had time for extras. And same with my study. I ended up so excited about what was happening at Citywide that I wanted to be. I came to the end of my 3 years and I wanted to stay here in Hobart, and ended up getting an honours project that just fell in my lap. And it would be very easy just to kind of go, yep, and then focus on my Citywide stuff and for my study to fall to the side. But I ended up getting through that year with some great marks, and I certainly owe that to God, in that honouring that if my priorities are firstly Him, then we see that great blessing, that storehouse blessing, not just again for me, but also for the community around. And I've certainly felt that. And Maria and I, as a couple working at our finances, we actually made a decision not to increase. We talked the other week about increasing our tithe as we have means to, with generosity. But for us, it was actually a decision that as our income decreased, that our tithing stayed the same. We made that choice to stay at what we were at. And again, we never had to be worried about money, and we've had a great blessing through that. And now Maria's heart too. We've been praying for a long time for more young families and young mums in our congregation. And Maria felt actually that strain of wanting to prioritise those relationships, but her work and her want for income had made it a tension. So we made that decision and prayerfully decided that she would be able to focus more on the families and resign from her work. And again, God has been gracious in that decision. And what I'm also very grateful for is that Citywide we have a range of people that have a variety of experiences with finances and have been able to talk to Maria and I about budgets, and even Morris here at Lena Valley was able to help me find our first house and helped walk us through that process. So I'm certainly grateful here at Citywide for having a family that can help me with these financial decisions and help make sure I'm walking wisely with that. And finally, as I look to where we're going and with knowing faithfully that God has blessed me through the tithe, and maybe here as we're on Facebook and maybe you would like to comment below, share. I'd love to hear your experiences of tithing but also God's blessing to do with finances and money and putting a priority on God first. But where to from here? As I have grown into dreaming, dreaming dreams and wanting to make sure more and more of my resources and my abilities are prioritising God, I really was captured by that thought of a tax going towards the glory of God, of improving the temple, of renovating the temple so that there is a glorious place that when you walk in that this could only be a glimpse of the glory of God. And I'd love to have a place that people resonate with that people walk in and they go, this gives us a little picture of the beauty of God. And I personally get that a lot from walking in the bush and in the wilderness. But not only that, but this idea of a storehouse to bless the community. So having a place that is open to being generous with hospitality, and also at the moment it breaks my heart of what is happening here in Hobart with the lack of accommodation and even short term, and so how can I use my resources to provide short term accommodation and things like that, and I wonder if that is actually a question for us at Citywide as we're on this journey of working out what we want to do this year, or where God's leading us towards. How can we look at using our budget, our tithe, our resources to bless the community, to store up blessing of generosity towards the community, and also for justice and for the needy and those that need our support and care. So I ask you to be prayerfully considering that, how we can be using our resources here at Citywide in honouring what we've just unpacked to do with tithing. So can I just leave you with this thought that with everything we've looked at today, the tenth, the tithe is really a starting point, and that God's saying, test me in this, not just being for ourselves, but actually being for the community, being for the poor and needy. So never to see the tithe as just ticking a box or a rule of life, and lose sight of the justice and the love of God that He calls us to be doing. So can I just pray for you now as we close this video? Lord, we just want to thank you that you have this pattern for life where you take the glory, you take the abundance, the provision that you have provided us in our everyday life, and you are able to use a portion of that to bless even more. And we just pray that as we've heard today what tithing is about and what Jesus had to say about that, and the true meaning being about a priority, being about a choice to not only lay down our life and our resources for you, but also to bless the community, to bless and be generous to those around us, to those that are serving you, Lord, to those that are part of your family, and for those that are needing a helping hand, that are needing a voice and needing resources to help them get them out of the situation that they're in. And so help us here, Lord, at Citywide on this journey to understand what it is that needs our immediate resource, that needs to see your kingdom come here, Lord. May we be a beacon of that for you. In your name, amen.